you might wonder, who are these people in the League? Are they ladies in hats, like our mothers or grandmothers, or gloves? The League of Women Voters, this kind of political activism actually began at a tea party. It was at a tea party in Boston. And I'm not sure that any women actually participated in this tea party because it consisted of throwing bales of tea over the ships to communicate something to the British, who were 3,000 miles away, which was, the message was, we are tired of you increasing the tax on tea, and we don't have any choice in this, and we are opposed to taxation without representation. Now, that came as something of a shock to the British because they had colonies all over the world and they were not throwing away their tea. Eventually, this kind of political activism became our Revolutionary War. This was the first obvious sign that the colonists were not entirely happy with the benign British government wearing red coats. So by the end of the Revolutionary War, and with the adoption of the Constitution, which finally took place in 1788.
80-something, 80.
Yeah. Took a long time to get
Yes,
the Constitution written and confirmed and so forth. But at that point, the men in America had achieved the right to vote on the people who had the power to raise their taxes. And all the men were given that vote, or at least most of them. And everybody thought it was a magnificent achievement for democracy. At that point, nobody much noticed that half the people in the country couldn't vote. More than half the people in the country couldn't vote for various reasons. Then we went along pretty well. Some people kept mentioning, well, shouldn't the women vote? And they kept saying, well, why do they need the vote? Their husbands vote, their fathers vote. They are protected. They are protected. We take all the responsibility for this voting stuff. And it went on that way all through until the Civil War. The Civil War was a desperate experience for the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people died on both sides. And at the end of the war, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the people who had been slaves were granted full citizenship. Well, they finally figured out that...
What about the women that were slaves?
Interesting you should ask. They, too, fell into the protect them from the necessity to vote. So even though people who had been slaves could vote. Now, that doesn't mean that the system was perfect, because there are still parts of the country where people with that ancestry have a hard time and may have to stand in line for 10 hours to cast their vote. But the law says they have that right. However, the women, including the women from the South who had been freed, they still were not deemed grown up enough or smart enough or educated. Well, anyhow, it didn't seem like a problem because that's the way things had always been. The next thing that came along was another devastating war, World War I. What happened was, it was not on our soil, it was in Europe, and America provided forces that went overseas, and these forces were, probably with the exception of some nurses, primarily men, leaving behind in the United States their jobs, their farms, their homes, their children. And every one of those jobs was picked up by some woman who stayed at home. So the women they took care of the children, they took care of the house, and they ran the farm, and they ran the businesses, and they took care of the bank. You know,
Right.
they filled the gap.
All the gap.
And maybe people looked around and said, well, they seem to be handling this pretty well. Maybe they have something to contribute to democracy. So at the end of the war, they were setting up international organizations. They were talking about democracy. 100-year tradition of people organizing to get women the vote finally got it in 1920 as part of a way of resolving what was a very obvious situation that came out of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may think that being able to vote, all women immediately started to vote. It didn't quite work out that way. I mean, there were the women who said, well, my husband votes on my behalf. My father votes on my behalf. I don't have to worry about things.
Right.
I do the cooking. So even though they had the vote and the legal right to vote, it took a while to get started. And it's only really been in this century, the 2000 century,
Yes.
that women have begun to be the majority,
Well, they're the majority
of all
of voters now.
voters.
Yeah.
And so people have noticed not only do they vote, but they make a difference in the outcome. Anyway, it was a very long road. But in 1920, the women who had been suffragettes and who had worked hard to get the vote decided to set up an organization that would help the people of the country not just to vote, but to vote wisely and with good information and with a balancing of both sides. And they set up the League of Women Voters with the purpose of providing the public with fair, unbiased, honest information. And that is what all of the volunteers in the League have been doing in the last 88 years.
Right.
And it's the reason the League has proven, I think, that ordinary voters and government officials can trust the information they give out.
I think so. Now, we also do study issues. And some of those issues, it seems to me, you go back to the issues of health care and workforce housing and working conditions and a lot of things. Those issues that were there in the League in 1920 seem to still be with us today.
Yes, you noticed. Before
ahead,
we
Margaret.
finished, I left out one part of the history.
Yes.
Okay. I got you as far as 1920 when the amendment passed. Okay, the smartest decision that the League made in the following 88 years was that at some point they decided, in the interest of fairness and equality, men should become eligible to join the League. I mean, this is our point. Okay. Now, at the time, it was slightly controversial. It has become an enormous asset. We have some wonderful men
Yes.
serving on our board.
Four men.
And they bring a whole new point of view that's very useful. The big hang-up when we were making this change is, what will we call this organization that now is truly open to all Americans? And they talked about the League of Men and Women Voters. They talked about the League of People Voters, the League of Human Voters, and people finally said, you've got a long tradition, people trust you, keep the name, but open the doors.
Right.
So that's what we did.
And that's what we did.
Right.
That's what we did.